My name is Christina McClellan, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
The Chief Curator at the University of Iowa
Marin,
Museum of Art, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Gigi Durham. I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Journalism, and I'm a woman at Iowa.
Welcome to the 4th season of Women at Iowa, a program that explores the work, experience, and history of women on the University of Iowa campus. I'm your host, Anna Bostwick Flaming, and our guest today is Jessica Hook, who is a research associate in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Iowa. Jessica, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So I know that you grew up in northeastern Oklahoma and that you got your BS from Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. So how did you first come to the University of Iowa?
Well, I did graduate from college in '99 and took a job as a medical technologist at a hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, St. Francis Hospital. It's similar in size to the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics, and I was working in the clinical lab, primarily in the blood bank, but also in hematology and microbiology. And I really enjoyed that job. I really did like it. But after doing that for 3 years, I kind of, it wasn't so challenging anymore, and it's incredibly demanding. And, you know, it was pretty typical to maybe get 15 minutes to eat and sometimes go the entire shift without getting a restroom break. So I realized pretty early on that that's not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And being a first-generation college student, I really didn't have ideas of, you know, other things to do necessarily. But I kind of knew I didn't want to go to medical school. I didn't want to go to law school. And so I just kind of started looking around at other options. And so I started looking online at graduate schools and realized that I could go to graduate school and work as a graduate assistant and have a stipend and get a waiver for my tuition. And so I thought, well, it seems maybe a silly reason to go to graduate school, but I thought, well, why wouldn't I go? You know, if I could get in, why wouldn't I go? So then I started looking at graduate schools and applying, and I looked in Colorado and Wisconsin, Iowa, and Oklahoma. And when I went to visit the schools, I just fell in love with Iowa City and decided to come here. So that was in 2001 that I came to Iowa City.
So you've told me that you maintain really close connections with your family and your friends back in the neighborhood that you grew up in. How did your move to Iowa change those relationships? Well, you know, I grew up in a neighborhood where, you know, certainly most of the adults that are the age of my parents didn't graduate from high school. It was a very working class community. And so going off to college was rare, and then moving away was really unusual, moving to another state. I think it was certainly very hard on my family, and I think people they just really couldn't relate, I don't think. They didn't understand why I needed to go so far away to go to graduate school. And I think, you know, part of it was the culture that I grew up in that small community, was that people didn't go away. You know, you grew up, you got married, you lived in the neighborhood, you had a family. And it's not like that was ever talked about explicitly or that there was pressure to do that. It's just that nobody really ever thought of doing anything different. And so I think that my going away to college and then moving away out of state was just, it was very unusual and just something totally different. But in the same degree, I don't think it was that shocking to people in my neighborhood, because I think my entire life I had kind of always been seen as the smart one and, you know, kind of different in that way. So I imagine that if it was different for you to go away to college, it must have been a really different decision when, as a teenager, you decided to move 2.5 hours away to go to boarding school at a prestigious high school called the Oklahoma School of Science and Math. So what made you decide to apply?
Well, I had not even heard of the Oklahoma School of Science and Math until my sophomore year in high school. And they, professors from the school will go all over the state and talk to kids at different high schools around the state. So they came to my school and did a pitch, and I was one of, 20 or 30 kids that went to listen to this pitch. And I thought it sounded amazing. I had always loved science and math from the time I was in kindergarten. I mean, math was just my favorite subject. So I thought, wow, this sounds really incredible. And so I got the materials, I took them home that night, and I remember when we were eating dinner, and I was telling my mom and dad about it. And I think in hindsight that maybe my mom was just in shock. My dad actually had heard about the school because he worked in construction, and I can't remember how, but for some reason he had heard about it through some work that he did in construction. So he at least knew about it and knew how far away it was. And I don't know what they were thinking at that time, but I told them that I wanted to apply, and I did. And then I found out that summer between my sophomore and junior years that I was accepted. And it's a tuition-free residential high school. And in hindsight, now I recognize that it was really tough on my mom because I'm the youngest of 3 children. And my brother had just enlisted in the Navy. And this was during the Gulf War. So he had just enlisted in the Navy and had left home. And that's a whole other kind of leaving home. And then to find out, a few months later that her youngest child is also going to be leaving home, and all of a sudden she's going to have an empty house. And I think at the time I was clueless about that and didn't think about it at all. But in hindsight now I recognize, especially now being a mother, how hard that was for her.
So tell me about a typical day at OSSM.
Well, it's been a while, but I was in the 4th graduating class of the school. It started in 92, so I was there, or actually started in 91. The first class was 92. I was there from 93 to 95. And the school is quite a bit different now. So the campus is actually located in downtown Oklahoma City, just a couple of miles from the state capitol, and right across from the University of Oklahoma Health Science campus. And if you were to drive by the campus, it's a really beautiful campus, but it has this big kind of iron gate, iron fence, that surrounds the whole thing. And so we always thought of it as kind of like a minimum security prison in downtown Oklahoma City. But at that time, they did not have dorms on the campus. So we actually lived at the University of Oklahoma in dorms on their campus in Cross Center C, for people who are familiar with the OU campus. So we lived there, and so a typical day for us would start about 7 o'clock in the morning, whenever everyone would roll out of bed, and then we would get on buses at 7:15 and take the 45-minute drive into Oklahoma City from Norman, and our classes started at 8 o'clock. So, many of us would get in a few more minutes of sleep on that bus ride and then roll off the buses, half awake, and stumble into our first class at 8 o'clock. And then we were on like a university schedule where we had classes Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, and then we typically would have lab classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And classes went from 8 to 4:30. But on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, it would be pretty typical to have a couple of 1-hour breaks. And then on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you might get lucky and get a 2 or 3 hour block where we could go to the library and study or meet with our professors or whatever during that time period. And at that time, it was all in one building. So it was really nice. All of our professors were in the same building, the administrators. So you really got to know everyone really, really well. So then at 4:30, we would get back on the buses, go back to Norman, and then 2 days a week, we would either have a physical education class or a fine arts class. And then we were kind of free to go and have dinner, you know, and whatever activities during that time, usually about, I don't know, 6 to 8 or 8:30. And then we had to be back in the dorms at 8:30. It was incredibly strict. We had mandatory study time from 8:30 to 10:30 in our dorms, and we were not allowed to leave the dorms after 8:30. And then at 10:30, we were all sent up onto our floors, and all the doors were locked, so we were all stuck on our floors. And then we had lights out at 11:30, and we did that day after day after day. And then once a month on Saturdays, we would have an exam from 8 to noon on the OU campus. So we would all get up early on Saturday morning and go somewhere on the OU campus and take a physics exam or a calculus exam for 4 hours. So it was a really intense experience. For most of the kids there were 15, 16, 17, kind of in that age range, from all over the state, from all kinds of backgrounds.
You talked about how strict it was. What happened if you weren't back in the dorm by 8:30?
You were sent home. It was really, I think, having that experience, sometimes I think that children growing up now are used to getting second chances, and third chances, and fourth chances. And that was a really radically different experience, I think, compared to the general culture that children grow up in, because there were no second chances. If you were not back in the dorms for whatever reason at 8:30, then you were sent home. And that was a huge consequence. If you were caught smoking, you were sent home. If you tried to sneak out of the dorms, you were sent home. I mean, it's just that there were no second chances. We knew what the rules were. There was no ambiguity. I mean, we knew what the rules were, and we knew the consequences for breaking the rules. And it was so devastating when someone would be kicked out for breaking the rules. And it would literally be, someone got caught breaking a rule the night before, and the next day their bags were packed and their parents were picking them up. So it was really, really a hard thing for all of us, but I think in the long run it's a really great life lesson that, sometimes you don't get second chances. And this was a huge privilege that we had to go to school there. So it's a tough lesson, but a good one.
So it makes me wonder, you were dealing with this really strict scheduling of your day, and you were also living on a college campus, taking college-level courses. So how did all of that affect your transition from high school into college?
I think it would be fair to say that on the one hand, I think academically, students who come from OSSM are just incredibly prepared academically for college. So like when I went to school, my first year, the academics were a breeze. Actually, nothing has been as challenging for me academically since high school, which sounds ridiculous, but it's true. So academically, college was a breeze. But I think the harder part for students coming from OSSM is that we are in such a tight-knit community. I mean, it's 75 students per class. And then we have all of these professors. I mean, we had incredibly small classes. Like my physics class would maybe have a dozen people in it. So we got to know our professors incredibly well. Some of the professors actually lived with us. And we saw them, they would come to the dorms on evenings and help us study. So it was really a family atmosphere. And so we not only got to know them, through our education, but we also got to know them on a personal level. We oftentimes knew their spouses, their children, their grandchildren. So when graduation day would roll around, all of the students came from across the entire state. And so we would talk about it feeling kind of like a divorce, as if, you know, this one day everyone gets ripped apart and you know that you're never going to see some people ever again. And you have kind of your really tight relationships that you try to maintain. But then we're all going to colleges and universities all over the country. So like my two closest friends, one went to Northwestern in Chicago and one went to Colorado College in Colorado. So we're in 3 different states. And that was in '95, and it makes me feel really old, but email was fairly new then. So my typical day, my first year in college, was to go to my classes, and I averaged over 18 hours a semester all through college, and then I also worked 20 to 30 hours a week. So I would go to class, I would go to work, and then when I came back to the dorms, I would go to the computer lab, and I would sit on the computer for 3 or 4 hours just catching up on email, you know, and instant messaging and talking to my friends. We didn't even have cell phones then. So, you know, we would talk online to our friends all over the country. And I would say that I probably spent the good part of the first year doing that, trying to maintain these connections and not really connecting with the kids I was going to college with, because frankly, I didn't have that much in common with them. But then kind of over time, you know, I made relationships at college and got more involved with things at college. And I still maintain those close relationships though with my friends that I went to OSSM with. But I think that that was a pretty typical experience for kids leaving OSSM and going to college. And I imagine now with cell phones and text messaging and Facebook, it's maybe even, you know, more extreme because they can stay connected in real time.
So we've interviewed a number of scientists on Women at Iowa, and something that a lot of them talk about is the experience of being one of maybe only a few women in their courses or the only woman in their workplace. I wonder, how has being a woman influenced your experiences in your field?
Well, I think if I go back to like whenever I was younger as a child, like I said, from kindergarten, math was my favorite subject. And in some ways, especially then, that kind of put me in the minority as a girl, being, you know, I was the smartest kid in class. You know, I was in kindergarten, I was doing my brother's math homework, and he was in 5th grade. And so I just, from a very early age, had a real love of math. And had really great teachers who really pushed me in that area. So I think that since I got started in it at such a young age, I never thought it was unusual. It was just my thing. And to their credit, the kids that I grew up with in my class and in my neighborhood, I never once was teased for being smart. I think that that's another thing that's unusual, that I kind of grew up in an environment where everyone thought it was cool. That I was also this big tomboy, you know, so I played soccer with the boys at recess and did all of those things, but they thought it was cool that I was smart and that, you know, they all came to me for help. So, and then going to OSSM was a really interesting experience because they, in their classes, they strive for gender equity. So all of a sudden I go into this really intense environment where I meet all these other kids who are just like me, and half of them are girls. So it was awesome. And then going away to college was a little different because all of a sudden I'm in physics classes where I'm the only woman in class. And I think that that's maybe when I first started realizing that there were more men in these areas. So, but then, you know, when I came to graduate school, it was certainly the case that there were more men. and most of the professors, most of the mentors that you could find were men. But I think that I was really fortunate that early in grad school I did find some really great female mentors. And now actually the job that I have now, doing basic science research in the Department of Pediatrics, my boss is a woman, and it's a really great job. It's a really great environment. I I hope that I have this opportunity to work with women throughout the rest of my career, because it is a different experience, I think, in science. There are very few women who are in, very high positions, whether it's being, the chair of a department or the dean of a college, or just being tenured professors. And especially finding women who are role models who have children who are in those positions is really rare. So I feel really fortunate in the, in the experience that I've had in my life, and now the position that I'm in, where I can work with other women that I can relate to, who are, intelligent and ambitious and hardworking and have families. And so I wish there were more that there were more examples like that for other women, but so I feel very fortunate.
You actually told me that of all of the people who've had a major influence on your life, it's the women of your neighborhood that have had the biggest impact. Mm-hmm. What have you learned from them, and how does it change the way you lead your life?
Oh, Anna, it's so true. Being a first-generation college student is not an easy thing. And I think that I'm lucky that I have friends that I went to OSSM with who are in the same position, who are now physicians and lawyers. But I guess just to back up, I would like to tell you a little bit about the neighborhood that I grew up in, and to kind of put it in context. So the neighborhood I grew up in was a post-World War II kind of track house community. So men, including my grandfather, came back from the war and settled in this little community termed West Tulsa, which isn't really a town, but that's what the locals would call it. And there were a few families like that, of men who came back from the war and settled there and built homes. And then they started to have families, and most of them had very large families, and raised their children there, and then their children bought houses there and raised families of their own. So that was the neighborhood that I grew up in. My mom was literally born on 45th Street and raised there, and then bought a home on 42nd Street that I grew up in. And my dad spent a big part of his childhood in the same neighborhood. So there were a few families, these large families in our neighborhood, the Walking Sticks, McCarty's, McLean's, Simmons, Woods, and so I knew, my parents grew up with all of these kids who then, started their families in the neighborhood. And so we knew everyone in our community. And it was a really wonderful way to grow up. But kind of the typical family in the neighborhood was living in poverty or near poverty. They were living paycheck to paycheck, no home insurance, no life insurance, no health insurance, none of the kind of, safety nets that I have today. And, anything could really push them over the edge. And this was also during the 80s. And most of the men in the neighborhood worked in construction. And my father was in construction. He worked as an iron worker and was a union member. And it was a very hard time for unions. And most of the construction jobs were going to low-skill, low-wage workers. And so my dad was laid off often during that time. And, and the other side of it is that a lot of men in the community were severely injured on the job. You know, there were men in my community who were severely disabled, who couldn't work. So it was a really rough time economically. And I lived in this entire neighborhood where family after family after family, that was the story. And yet we all go on, you know, and I would say, to their credit, most of the men in the community would have done anything to take care of their families. My dad was certainly willing to take any job. He did everything that he could. You know, he would sell fishing equipment or sell a hunting dog or whatever he had to do whenever push came to shove. But I think as a girl growing up in that community, what influenced me most was seeing how the women really held the families together. So it was not unusual for women to work 2 and 3 jobs, you know, and these were mostly food service jobs, fast food, school cafeterias, waiting tables, grocery clerks, secretaries, because like I said, you know, in that generation, in my parents' generation, most of them didn't even graduate from high school. So their options for employment were limited. And so these women were doing whatever they had to do to bring home enough money to, you know, keep the house, to keep food on the table. And yet at the same time, they had dinner on the table every night. They did the laundry. School lunches were made every day. You know, homework got done. It's really incredible, I feel like, just their physical stamina and the mental strength that they had to go on. I mean, you can imagine in that kind of situation, there was a lot of depression and a lot of alcohol abuse, domestic violence, divorce. You know, it was the really, really, really rough times. And yet the women persevered, and I don't want to make it out like they're saints or anything. You know, they had their flaws. They weren't perfect. They weren't angels by any means. But in this, you know, culture of instability, from my perspective as a young girl, I saw the women holding everything together and creating this environment of stability where things could unravel at any moment. And so as a kid, even though all this chaos was kind of going on around us, you know, I always felt very safe and secure in my home. And I think that that is a huge gift. And so now, you know, having a young family of my own now and looking back on what reality was like for them, I just feel like, you know, I don't know that I have that kind of strength. You know, and I guess if you're in this situation, you do whatever you have to do. But, you know, and going back home now and seeing them and, you know, they had a very, very hard life. And I think that it's not because they weren't intelligent, you know, or that they weren't hardworking. There are many men and women in my neighborhood who are incredibly intelligent, who have incredible skills, but they just never had the opportunities, you know, to reach their potential. You know, they could have been business owners or veterinarians or whatever, but that just wasn't reality for them. So I think that it's just that growing up in that kind of environment and the work ethic that they had, the men and the women in my community, I think had a huge influence on me. And I think at an early age I recognized that that wasn't the life that I wanted. And I think that I made a connection early on between education and having a different kind of life. And I know my father would say education is the one thing that no one can take from you. And so though my parents never really pushed me, they never really encouraged me to go to college or pushed me in that direction, there was clearly this sense that education was important and that you should take advantage of it as much as you can. So I think that all of those lessons, growing up in that environment have really shaped who I am now. And I think also my strong sense of giving back to the community all stems from that experience, growing up in that environment, seeing the lack of opportunities that women and children had in my community, and really, I feel like I'm in a position where I'm very privileged now, and I have the chance to give back. And so in some ways, I guess I feel like it's my duty or responsibility to. So I think that was a long way to answer your question, but.
So I know, as you said, that you have a toddler at home, and yet you also work full-time outside of the home. So how do you balance the demands? And is the way that you grew up and the women that you saw, does that have an influence on the way you balance those demands?
I feel so incredibly fortunate because I do work full-time outside the home, which honestly, working 40 hours outside of the home doesn't really seem like that much to me. I think, and that probably is partly influenced by the way that I grew up. So I feel incredibly fortunate that I can go to a job every day that I really love, that's really intellectually stimulating and challenging, and I have that experience, to kind of feed me and drive me in an intellectual way. But then my husband, now, while we have a toddler at home, he works full-time at home taking care of our daughter. And it's really amazing. I mean, it's just really, it's a great partnership, I feel like. And I knew long before we waited. We'd been married 10 years before we had children. And I always knew that I didn't want to stay home full-time, that I needed to do something outside of the home. My husband is a musician, and so being at home allows him an opportunity to be home with our daughter, but also to, be creative and, explore his musical creativity and things like that. And he can also do that in the evenings, and practice with bands and play shows and all of that. So it's been a really great balance for us. And then whenever I come home from work, then I get that opportunity, to spend time with my daughter. And on the weekends, we share responsibilities and taking care of her and doing things together as a family. So, I mean, honestly, I feel like in many ways I'm incredibly blessed, and just really, in that sense, things really couldn't be any better. I have an 8-to-5 job where I don't have to work on holidays and weekends. So, I mean, it's great.
So do you think that your family back home and people here in Iowa, are they supportive of the arrangement that you have in your family?
Definitely. I think, well, first of all, I think my daughter's just incredibly fortunate to have this time, at home with her dad. And also, seeing her mom in the position that I'm in, I think that she's incredibly fortunate. And, I think that 20 or 30 years ago, this setup maybe would have been very unusual, but I think now it's becoming more and more common, and especially in this community. So I think that it's the right setup for us. It's not what would work for every family, but it is what is right for us. And I feel really lucky that we can, that we can do what is right for us.
So in addition to your paid work, you're really active in a number of social justice activities. I wonder, do you feel like there's any overlap between your professional life and your volunteerism?
Well, I certainly think that the skills that I have as a scientist translate into the volunteer work that I do. And I think with any volunteer work, with any organization, you want to recruit people with all different kinds of backgrounds, because people bring different experiences and skill sets. And I think as a scientist, I'm very analytical and very pragmatic. And so I bring a certain perspective, certainly, to the organizations that I volunteer with. But I also think, I mean, you know, my life has just been so enriched by the opportunities that I've had to volunteer with different organizations. And I've certainly been challenged in ways I could have never imagined. In a volunteer organization, you get the opportunity to take on things that you maybe never would otherwise. And I have certainly gained a lot of skills and learned a lot of things that translate into my career as a scientist, but also just into my personal life.
So I know that you are a member of the League of Women Voters and that you're very much engaged in electoral politics. How did you first become involved? I think the first campaign I got involved with was here in Iowa City. But if I think back on it, you know, my father was involved when I was a kid. I remember he was like the leader of the sewer board whenever they were trying to get sewer in our neighborhood. And he campaigned, I remember he campaigned for a sheriff in our town. And my dad, I think, certainly was seen as a leader in our neighborhood. And so I do think in some respects I'm very much like him in certain ways. And was always interested, I think even as a young kid, I was always interested in politics. You know, I watched the Jim Lehrer News Hour, you know, whenever I was 13 years old. And so probably was more conscious of politics than most kids my age. And certainly during the Reagan years, my dad had plenty to say about Reagan every night when we would be watching the nightly news and eating dinner. So I guess maybe I grew up with some idea about politics. And then I came to Iowa City, and Iowa is just an incredibly politically engaged, you know, overall I would say the average Iowan is much more politically savvy and politically engaged than, you know, citizens in other states. And particularly in Johnson County. So I had an opportunity, I think, early on to start just volunteering with campaigns, with, you know, helping with mailings and those sorts of things. And then the first campaign that I really kind of jumped into and really did a lot of substantial work, I think, would be Regina Bailey's campaign for city council. And I was the co-campaign manager for that. And to Regina's credit, she really saw that campaign as an opportunity to train younger people and newer people to get them involved in local politics. And so Karen Cubby was the other campaign manager who has a ton of experience. So it was an awesome opportunity for me to work with her and really learn the nuts and bolts of a campaign and putting it together from the very beginning, and you know, the strategy up front, and just then all of the nuts and bolts of, you know, ordering the yard signs and putting out the yard signs and letters to the editor and kind of every aspect of the campaign. And it was really a lot of fun. I really, really loved it. I think that it's an experience that kind of taps into many of my skills. It also challenges me to get outside my comfort zone, but I really love the really analytical parts about it, you know, really analyzing the different precincts and being strategic about, you know, where we went with our yard signs and door knocking, and to kind of try to maximize, you know, the voting in certain precincts that were going to be good for us, you know. And I really loved all of that kind of strategy and just thinking about campaign on that kind of level. So So I know that you were a driving force behind the establishment of the Iowa New Leadership Program, which is an intensive training course that empowers women to take on public leadership roles. So how did you first get involved in that?
Well, I was a volunteer at the Women's Resource and Action Center. This was toward the end of my time as a graduate student here. I was really looking for something outside of graduate school. I really needed something. Graduate school can be really isolating, and I think I needed some connection outside of that world. So I became a volunteer at the Women's Resource and Action Center, and I was working with this group of women called Iowa Women Initiating Social Change, and that was a really great experience. It was a whole year long. We were just kind of a group. We met once a week, for a year and learned about different ways of social change initiatives and worked on a few things. And then at the end of that year, there was kind of like a volunteer appreciation event at the Women's Center. And Monique DiCarlo, who was the director at the time, just kind of made an announcement to the group that she was interested in starting this women's public leadership program. And just said, if anybody's interested in working on this or finding out more about it, come and talk to me. So I went and talked to her, and then kind of immediately started volunteering, kind of researching different programs around the country, and just looking at what might be feasible for the Women's Center, and it kind of took off from there.
So you've also been a woman who is a leader in the public, as you're encouraging people to do with the New Leadership Program. For instance, you were chair of the board of directors of the Emma Goldman Clinic. Can you tell me a little bit about what it means to be chair of the board?
Well, I served on the Emma Goldman Clinic board for 5 years, and for 2 of those years I was the chair. So the board as a whole is really the supervisor for the executive directors at the clinic. And it's a governing board. And the chair is really in charge of, the chair is also the chair of the executive committee, which, sets agendas for meetings. The chair would facilitate meetings, really, work closely with the executive directors to, make sure the organization is moving in the path that they want it to move in. The chair is really involved in strategic planning, and thinking about the long-term future. And I would say also just serves as a good role model, as a good board member, of all, good attendance, being involved in all of the things that a board member should be involved in, like fundraising for the organization, recruiting new members to serve on the board, public advocacy, whether that's writing letters to the editor or just attending events as a representative of the clinic or talking to people in the community about the clinic. So, the chair wears many different hats at many different times. It's also, I think, a mentor to other board members, particularly new board members. So it's kind of interesting because a lot of these things that I worked on, like the New Leadership Program and the Bailey campaign, and when I was the chair of the Emma Goldman Clinic, all of those things actually happened at the same time. And so it was probably at no other time in my life would I have that much time and energy to devote to all of those kind of activities. But it was really an awesome time for me in my life, and I feel incredibly fortunate that I had that opportunity. And everything was complementary, The things that I was doing with new leadership were, like skills I would learn in one area, I would apply in another area, or things that I was doing on the board or experiencing on the board, I could apply to the Bailey for Iowa City campaign. So it was just this, couple of years of like incredible growth for me. And I met amazing people during that time. But particularly serving on the Emma board. Actually my time on the board just ended a few days ago. So I'm still kind of in this transition period of not being on the board anymore, but it was probably the most rewarding volunteer work that I've ever done in my life. I certainly feel very strongly about the organization, and I just feel really fortunate that I had a chance to be involved with Emma.
So you're also one of the earliest committee members of the Herstory Committee of the Council on the Status of Women, which is the group that, among other things, puts on Women at Iowa. So I wonder, how did you first get involved with Herstory?
Well, Herstory started, the Women at Iowa program started 1 year before I joined the Council on the Status of Women. So it was 3 women, Diana Harris, Renee Supel, and Kelly Johnson, who were all members of CSW at the time, who really, got Women at Iowa going. And then I came a year later as a member of CSW. And, I think it was the very first meeting. They gave this pitch of all of the possible committees that you could work on. And I thought Herstory sounded fantastic. So I joined Herstory and started working on Women at Iowa. And I feel like that year, in the second year, we did a really good job of creating job descriptions for all of the different roles that you have to put on a television show. And I feel like really, got things organized and prepared for the following year. So those first 2 years, a staff member chaired the committee. And then the third year, a graduate student chaired the committee. And I feel like that in those first 2 years, the committee did a really good job of, setting up really good systems to make sure this committee could keep going, and having clear job descriptions, clear expectations of what each member of the committee was responsible for. And it's just been a pleasure to serve on the committee because everyone does their part, It's one of the few committees I've served on that I didn't chair or, take on some role like that. So it's been great that I could serve on the committee in more of an advisory role as a staff member who does have connections in the community. And so I could really provide my strengths to the committee and not take on kind of a leadership position in the committee. And it's been amazing because, that first year with 3 members, I think the second year we had around 8 members. And the third year, I don't know, a dozen or, it's just grown each year and has become a really great committee for students, undergraduate students and graduate students to come and learn what it's like to serve on a committee and to take on leadership roles in the committee. And also just the great experience that students have in being able to produce a television show or host a television show or, and that's the whole idea of being involved with committees where you get these opportunities to do things that you probably wouldn't be able to otherwise.
So I think we have just a few minutes remaining. It's a Women at Iowa tradition to ask all of our guests to recommend some sort of book that tells us a little bit more about their perspective. So to sum all of this up, what book would you recommend?
Well, I'll try to keep it brief, but there are actually 2 books that came to mind. I knew this question was coming, and there are 2 books that I read as a teenager that had a huge impact on me that I have gone back to several times over the years. And so the first is 80 Years and More, which is an autobiography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. My American history professor, Dr. Dorothy Dodd at OSSM, actually suggested that I read that book. And I think I identified as a feminist long before that and had kind of been outed as a feminist by my classmates years before. But I think reading that book was the first time I really solidified what feminism meant to me. and I think had a huge impact on helping me shape who I was as a person and, you know, what kind of woman that I wanted to be.
And so the second book?
Is Beloved by Toni Morrison, which I also first read as a teenager. And I think, especially growing up in Oklahoma, it was just a perspective that I had never experienced before. And so I had learned about slavery, you know, I'd learned about the Civil War, but here was a book that was written about people. You know, it wasn't about slavery, you know, it was about people. And I think that it made me relate in a way that I had never had before to just other people and their struggles and their stories, you know, and seeing how we all are connected. And that book in particular, I think, challenged me a lot. And of course, she's just an amazing writer. And I've gone back to that book. It's the kind of book that you have to read, I think, at different points in your life to really grasp it all.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for being here with us today. And thank you for joining us for another episode of Women at Iowa.